Good afternoon and welcome to Mets 360 here on Riverside. I'm your host, Brian Jura, and I'm pleased to welcome back to the show one of the writers from the site, and that's Ryan Johnson. Ryan, welcome.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
All right, well, let's get right to it. Anyone who isn't living under a rock knows that Pete Alonso broke the Mets all-time franchise record for home runs last night. He now has 254, two ahead of Darryl Strawberry. So tell me, what did Alonso breaking that home run mark mean to you?
So I actually live in the same neighborhood as one of the other writers on Mets 360, Steven Traeger. And at last year's block party, he and another neighbor and I were talking about the Mets, and they asked who my all-time favorite Met was. And I thought about it, and I was debating between Jacob deGrom and Pete Alonso, and I ultimately said Pete Alonso. They both said Tom Seaver. Guess that shows the age difference a bit there.
Old guys.
Yeah, but I think Pete was inevitable to break this record. We all talked about it at the beginning of the season, and I think that the record was breakable primarily because Darryl Strawberry didn't finish his career as a Met. With that being said, Pete might not finish his career as a Met either, but I think after the ceremony of David Wright retirement, number retirement, and how much David Wright meant to the franchise, I think Pete would be remiss to accept an offer from anywhere other than Queens. And if he stays a career Met, he'll be the next lock to have his number retired. So I think Pete is as big of an impact player on this team as any player has been in recent memory. He has this team first attitude, which I think he demonstrated by his interviews after the game yesterday, staying laser focused on we have a job to do. We're in the playoff hunt. This is a great milestone. I'm really stoked about it, but it's team first. And it's something I find commendable about him. He was the first jersey that I ever bought as a Mets fan, and I'm glad he's been playing so well in the month of August to merit a nice, kind discussion about the breaking of the home run record.
You know, I can't imagine that any Mets fan is disappointed that Alonso was the one to break Strawberry's record. Darryl was definitely a very popular Met, although he didn't leave under the best of circumstances. And I think Pete, who wears his heart on his sleeve, I think he's somebody that most everybody has a very favorable opinion of in Mets land. So I know that perhaps I'm a little tougher on him than some others, but I'm very glad that he now holds the record, and if he wants to continue to hit like he has in August, yes, please.
Exactly. I don't think anybody would complain about Pete returning to form, can we say, because he hit pretty well in April. Pete returning to form and mashing home runs on a regular basis.
So last night's win snapped a seven-game losing streak, and it was also, I think, they lost 11 of their last 12. And in that stretch, neither the hitting or the pitching was particularly good. So I want to know which one for you has been more frustrating, the hitting or the pitching during this losing stretch?
For me, it's been the hitting. It's hard to complain about hitting a day after we just hit 6 home runs in one game. But being honest, these guys have been lifeless after the 5th inning in just about every game during this latest stretch. I was thinking about it last night, and Howie Rose's catchphrase, "put it in the books," came to mind. And I thought, Howie could really start saying, "put it in the books" after the 5th inning as soon as the Mets go down by a run, because they literally never come back in these games. I did a little research, and the Mets have had 2 7-game losing streaks so far this year, dating back to June. Since June 1st, the Mets are 27-33. Mets are 12-3 in games in which they scored 6 or more runs. They've scored 3 or fewer runs in 25 games, and they're 5-20 in those games. In the 20 remaining games that they've played since June 1st, in which they've scored 4 or 5 runs, they have a record of 10-10. So don't get me wrong, the pitching has been really bad, as evidenced by Clay Holmes looking horrible last night. But when the pitchers have put forward some strong performances in this latest stretch of bad games, the Mets offense, in my opinion, has been the culprit for not picking up the slack. And that's been the most frustrating part for me to watch as a fan because you feel like the game's over. They're not going to score any more runs, even if the pitchers had a decent game. What about for you?
So I think this is one of those ones that you could go either way and not be wrong. I don't think that there's a clear answer. I know that coming into the season, I think most Mets fans were pretty confident in the offense, and the pitching, specifically the starting pitching, was going to be a question mark. And then the starters got off to a great beginning, and we all changed our tune. And reality has set in, I suppose, for some of these starters. And it's tough. It's hard to go very far if you can't count on anyone but David Peterson going more than 5 innings. And I don't think that I'm unrealistic in expecting pitchers to go 8 or 9 innings every time out, but we can't have games like last night where the starting pitcher only went 3.2 innings. But so I could be talked into the starters, but like you said, the hitters have left a lot to be desired too. Very streaky. The last game they won before this, they scored 12 runs. So it's almost like they need to score double digits in order to have a shot at winning here recently. Hopefully, with David Peterson pitching today, they won't need quite so many runs to win. But the pitching is still a question mark. We were talking before we went live about some changes that are coming up, and looks like Nolan McLean might get a start on Saturday. So who knows? Maybe that'll be the boost or the kick in the pants, depending upon which way you look at it, that the rotation needs. And maybe Senga and Manaya in particular can start giving what we expect of them.
I don't think it's crazy to assume that when David Stearns assembled this team, you could look at the roster and the back of the baseball cards and say, this team is going to score a lot of runs. It's okay if my starting pitching is middle of the road. If they give up 5 runs in a game, we have Juan Soto, Pete Alonso, Francisco Lindor, Brandon Nimmo, Jeff McNeil. We're going to score 12 runs a game. Obviously, none of these guys have really stepped up to hit with runners in scoring position. My goodness. And I think at the end of the day, we've had to scramble to assemble a strong bullpen because, like you said, the starters are not giving any length and the bats are not giving any wiggle room.
Earlier, you ran down a bunch of numbers on how the Mets do when they score a certain amount of runs. And to me, those numbers aren't surprising because the major league average runs per game is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.25. I haven't looked at it recently. So if you're scoring 6 runs a game, you really ought to have a good record. And on the flip side, if you're scoring 3 runs or fewer, you really shouldn't have a good record. So to me, it fits in for the numbers that you just threw out there. We'd be interested to see what the pitching numbers are because the last 2 wins they've scored 25 runs, and I don't know what it was before then, but the hitters have had several games where they've put up 6 runs here recently that they haven't won, and that shouldn't be.
Right. I was surprised to see the 3 losses in the last 2 months where we scored 6 or more. And one of them was the recent loss to Cleveland, 6-7.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about somebody who I think is shaping up to be somewhat of a polarizing figure, and that's Cedric Mullins. When the Mets acquired him, he was on a hot streak, and then he didn't hit very much at all his first few games. But then yesterday, he had a 2-hit game. So, where do you stand on his acquisition and what he might provide for the club down the stretch?
So my sister-in-law's boyfriend is from Baltimore and is a big Orioles fan, and he really sold me on the SETI trade. I was convinced he was going to be an impact player for the team right away. But like you mentioned, he's pretty much been invisible from the start of his time here, maybe starting to have a little bit more of an impact recently. He hasn't had the highlight reel plays like he had in his last few games in Baltimore. He's certainly not hitting like he had been. But any way you slice the pie, Stearns needed to address the hole in center field. I personally would have liked to go after Harrison Bader. In fact, one of the pieces that I wrote for the Mets 360 a few months ago, looking at where are they now players. Bader was one of them that I said, where is he now? And he was playing well for the team that he was on, and it was for the Twins. And it was like, I wouldn't have hated keeping Harrison Bader around here. But it sounded after the trade deadline like we were actually trying to go get Byron Buxton, which would have been a huge upgrade. I think Cedric Mullins is better than Taylor, even if it's a minor upgrade. Mullins clearly has more upside. He hit a home run recently. When's the last time Taylor hit a home run? Can you even remember? I think the real consequence of signing Mullins has actually been on the juggling of Vientos, Beatty, and Mauricio now that McNeil is stapled in at second base every day. That's where he should be, by the way. I don't think he was like a plus player in center field, but I do think he's a very positive player at second base. So I don't love the logjam that was created as a result of signing Cedric Mullins. And I think that the players, Vientos, Beatty, and Mauricio, would benefit from more consistency. But technically, we upgraded center field and second base by that signing. So not a bad signing with some additional upside.
So to me, it wasn't enough of an upgrade. I mean, you still got McNeil playing, so his hitting is a wash. He's a better defensive second baseman than he is a defensive center fielder, but it's not like he was awful in center field. Mullins clearly better, probably doesn't have the arm that McNeil does in center field, but probably does everything else better. So I don't see it as a huge upgrade defensively. And you mentioned the issue that it created in that all of a sudden there's one fewer spot for McNeil. I mean, not McNeil, Beatty, Mauricio, and Vientos. And then last night we had Beatty at third base, and Marte was the DH. So two of the three guys who you said needed playing time were sitting on the bench. They scored 13 runs. The end justifies the means. So I guess we can't be too disappointed. But I think in the long run, I'm not a huge fan of the Mullins acquisition, and I won't shed any tears when he's playing elsewhere next year.
I was thinking about it the other day. Do you think that the Mets outfield that we're running out there between Nimmo, Mullins, and Juan Soto might be the weakest arm strength of any outfield in the majors?
I think a case certainly can be made for that because Mullins in center field makes you long for having Nimmo out there. I don't think Soto's arm is bad, but in right field, we're used to guys with a cannon, and
Yeah.
he doesn't necessarily have that. So I would say they're probably in the bottom five for sure. Are they the worst? Maybe. But, if you have to be the worst in something, that's not the worst thing to be in outfield arms. It's always nice when outfielder makes a play, a throw, and there's an out on the base paths, but it's not really something that teams should be building their fortunes upon, in my opinion.
I agree. And I do remember a few Tyrone Taylor tosses in, to home plate or whatever, where he's throwing guys out. And you think, wow, that's a nice arm he's got on him there. I don't think Mullins is anywhere as close to that. And I literally cringe every time I see Brandon Nimmo throw the ball in. I'm like, oh my God, this guy maybe the biggest noodle arm in all of left field.
I always talk about wanting to see foot races, like who's slower, Wilmer Flores or Mark Vientos. And
Sure.
then maybe we can have like the equivalent of that and have Nimmo and Mullins throw. But my money would be on Nimmo. I think he's got a better arm than Mullins. All right, well, let's talk about the pitching here for a second. Justin Hageman had a very nice 4 inning save on Tuesday, and his reward was a trip to the minors, which every single one of us saw coming. Do we just accept that that's the way that it is? That a reliever comes in and does a good job in a multi inning role and is gone the next day? Or is it possible to have a solution to this issue?
We've seen David Stearns do this the whole season. And I think that's why we have guys like Hagenman, Waddell, Austin Warren around this team because their value comes in their ability to pitch well enough to occupy the last spot in the bullpen, but also in their flexibility to be moved up and down from the minors to create that roster flexibility and get fresh arms into the bullpen on a regular basis. I think Hagenman knows that's his role. Waddell, Warren, they know that. If anything, I think that signing guys or bringing guys like Rogers, Helsley, and Gregory Soto have now kind of locked the Mets bullpen in place a lot more. So there's now a lot less flexibility to manipulate the roster with the fringe guys like Hagenman and Waddell and Warren. It's not like we're going to DFA Ryan Stanek anytime soon here, although you might make an argument for it. And now that Montas is in the bullpen, there's really no roster moves to make there anymore. Reports came out today that Paul Blackburn is going to be rejoining the club in the bullpen, and that was the move the Mets made, was to send Hagenman down to AAA. But it's also been reported that McLean's on his way up for Saturday, and the Mets will have to make a roster move by then to make room for him. So my prediction is Paul Blackburn probably going to get DFA'd as a corresponding move to bring up McLean. What do you think?
Well, I mean, perhaps, but I guess I'm more interested in we know the reason why this happens, why relievers come up and have a multi-inning performance and then are gone the next day, whether it's an option or a DFA. But it just seems to me that it can't be good for the game. Big picture look, just not just the Mets. I mean, this happens with every team that's a contender for the most part. And I mean, I think it's something that the commissioner loves to tinker. So maybe this is something that he should consider tinkering. This here today, do great, gone tomorrow, because sorry, we need somebody else in that role. I don't think that's baseball the way that it should be.
I definitely think that the system we have set up, by we, I mean the MLB, the system that the MLB has set up around the minors and player options, I think they've tweaked that somewhat recently in order to limit the amount of time. A guy has to be in AAA for 10 or 15 days before you can call him back up. Where I really see it as a major issue is around the DFAing of players. So a guy like Rico Garcia, you sign him, he comes in, he throws well for a little while, but then you DFA him. In my opinion, that's the more egregious move. We're talking about people's lives here and their livelihood, and now they don't have a home and they don't have a place they don't know where their next team's going to be. At least with the optioning down to AAA, at least in the Mets system, you're still in New York State. You're still an option to come back to the team at a later point during the season. But I definitely hear your point that the roster manipulation moves that are tinkering with sometimes players that are really productive can be detrimental to getting to know a team, getting to know the players, cheering for that team as a result.
Yeah, excellent point because Justin Hageman getting a 4 inning save, and I believe he didn't even allow a hit. That should be something that we're talking about as fans. And instead, it's just like, oh well, he's no longer on the team, and I think that that can't possibly be good for the sport. All right, well. Earlier, you were talking about the log jam of the infielders with Beatty and Mauricio and Vientos. How do you feel Carlos Mendoza is doing juggling those three in the playing time? And is there anything he could be doing differently with those guys?
I think it's a really tricky situation. I've heard a lot around Mets circles, a call for Beatty to go back to AAA, bring up Acuna as more of that defensive, speedy guy on the base paths type of player. And then you're not really dealing with the question marks of Beatty, Mauricio, Vientos, because Acuna has that defined role as he's just going to be the speed guy. He would have scored if he had taken Marte's place against the Brewers. Like those types of conversations are happening. But then turn around and Beatty's hitting a home run last night and he hit a home run a few games ago. And he's going on a tear. And all of a sudden it's like, well, no, you can't send Beatty down to AAA. Vientos seemingly goes on a hot streak only to get benched for pitching matchups. And then Mauricio seems to be a wild card on a day-to-day basis as to whether he'll be clutch or he'll be ho-hum. And like I mentioned, I think signing Cedric Mullins and moving McNeil is ultimately elbowing out some of the young guys from their regular playing time. So I don't envy Mendoza's position in trying to figure out his lineup on a day-to-day basis because essentially he's going to be wrong or piss somebody off at any turn. He starts Beatty at third base and Vientos and Mauricio, ride the pine because Marte's been hitting pretty well too. So, like I mentioned, technically both center field and second base have been upgraded from a defensive standpoint. So I guess we can't be too mad that the team's technically better and that we have a carousel of players splitting time between third base and DH. I think if any of those three players had really stood out, it wouldn't be much of a question at all. But unfortunately, none of them have really gone on to exceed expectations. And it's led to Mendoza just trying to either ride the hot hand or play pitching matchups. So do I think he could be doing things differently? Not with the hand that he's been dealt, because the players aren't forcing his hand in any way. What do you think?
With Mullins, he has to give him some playing time, at least initially, to see what they have. And he didn't get off to a good start. He got a couple of hits yesterday and had home run, like you mentioned. So we're going to see him at least another week or so. But if he doesn't hit in that time frame, I don't think you can just keep writing him into the lineup like he's Alonso or Lindor who play every day. And then I think that's another thing that they have to at least consider is, you know, maybe Francisco Lindor could benefit from some time off. Ditto Alonso, ditto Nimmo, ditto Soto. And I know it's tough to not write one of those guys in the lineup, but sometimes that's penny wise and pound foolish. Sometimes you need to take a bigger look at things. And I'm sorry, I'm just not a fan of guys playing 162 games a year. If you're playing 150, 155 games, that's a full season, and you get that day off every now and then to give you an emotional reboost. Get back into the swing of things, and then maybe you don't have an 0 for 20 like Nimmo or an 0 for 21 like Lindor. So I think that Mendoza could be doing more than he's doing to get playing time for the three baby Mets from 2023.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's easy to Monday morning quarterback, especially like you said, when you score a dozen or 13 runs, is that a baker's dozen in a game? And you say, oh, it worked. But today's game is going to be a different bear. So we'll see. I think that Mendoza showed last year that he's willing to bench players that aren't performing. Harrison Bader being the example that I'm thinking of during the playoff run. Tyrone Taylor played better, so he got most of the starts. I think once it becomes crunch time, your assumption about Mullins not necessarily getting the start every day is probably similar to what the type of decision making Mendoza is going to make moving forward as we push for the playoffs.
Well, let's talk about Frankie Montas. I don't feel like anybody was doing jumping jacks when they signed him in the offseason, and then he got hurt. And now that he's back, he's been terrible. And now it's been announced that he's moving to the pen. Do you feel like he's past his injury now and he can be an asset in the pen? Or do you think it's going to be more of the same lousy pitching we've seen since he's been activated?
I agree that nobody was excited about Frankie Montas. I think I had a shred of hope that the pitching lab was going to make Montas into the next Griffin Canning. I mean, why not? It's a pretty low bar to hope that Montas is going to be the next Griffin Canning, by the way, but you get the point, I think. Montas, in my mind, is one of those contracts that David Stearns has a little egg on his face with. Last year, it was Adrian Hauser, but it was a little easier to move on from Hauser because Hauser started off as a starter, got moved to the bullpen, and ultimately got cut. But he was on a 1-year contract at a relatively low cost. Montas has shown next to no value from day one. And there's no reason he's not going to opt in to his nice, juicy payday next year with the Mets in this whatever role he's going to be. And so I think this was a case of Stearns rushing to sign a guy at the beginning of the offseason and having it be a huge bust. We could have had a guy like Quintana on a cheaper deal, and he's been way better, way more consistent, offered way more innings for the boy. Who's Quintana playing for right now? I was going to say the Brewers. Is that right?
I believe so.
So for as many good signings that Stearns has made, I think he's had some awful ones too. Joey Wendell, Zach Short, Adrian Hauser,
Well,
Montas, Blackburn.
let's specifically talk about Montas and his move to the pen. Do you see him being able to provide value there?
I think he'll soak up meaningless innings or he'll pitch in situations with huge leads, and that he's going to essentially be an overpaid Justin Hagenman.
And that's probably the most likely outcome. The one thing that gives me just a sliver of hope is that his fastball is pretty good and his splitter is pretty good. So if he can go to the pen and just focus on those two pitches and scrap the rest of them, and he's throwing 96, 97 as a starter when he's allegedly pacing himself, to go 6 innings. What if he's out there only going an inning or two at a time? Could he be throwing 98, 99? And will the difference between the fastball and the splitter stand out even more then? Um, maybe it's grasping at straws, and I won't argue with you if that's the way that you feel. But I think there's at least some hope that the move to the pen can be beneficial for Montas this season.
I can be optimistic with you that maybe a change of scenery for him will mean better results. I think during his rehab stints in Syracuse, where he put up horrible ERA, he wasn't going very deep into games, only getting 2 to 3 innings and giving up a lot of runs. So I don't feel as confident as you do when it comes to Montas and his ability to contribute meaningful, even high leverage innings for the Mets down the stretch here.
All right, well, let's talk about a little bigger picture item, and that's that the first place Phillies right now are playing a series against the Reds, who are the closest team to the Mets in the wild card chase. So, do you have a preference on who wins the games in those matchups, and if so, why?
I've heard this asked across a bunch of podcasts lately, and in my opinion, the correct answer is the Reds. By saying the Reds, you're telling the world that you believe the Mets can take care of business and that the NL East is still up for grabs. So we want the Phillies to lose so we can make it interesting in the division. And we're also saying we don't believe the Reds are a threat to catch us as long as the Mets are playing well. The Reds took the first game yesterday against the Phillies, and the Mets did their part too. I think we're only 5 games back now. So I think the correct answer is the Reds, because how can you feel good about yourself rooting for the Phillies?
That is a very valid point. I guess my take on this issue is it doesn't make a difference. The only thing that the Mets need to worry about here in the second week of August is how they're playing. Because if they're not good enough to hold off the Reds for the wild card, then they don't deserve to be in the playoffs. The Mets need to get their own ship straightened out and then we can go from there. And when September rolls around, middle of September maybe, then we can scoreboard watch and worry about, are the Phillies winning or are the Reds winning or whatever the case may be. But right now, Mets, take care of yourself.
It's all you can do. You're in the driver's seat. You have the wild card spot in hand. Don't lose a million games in a row, and you can make the playoffs.
All right. Well, we have reached the crazy prediction segment of the show, and I'll give you what I feel is a crazy prediction and then ask you to comment on it. And then we'll flip roles where you give me your crazy prediction and I'll let you know what I think. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Brandon Nimmo, one of my favorites. Last 15 games, he has a 510 OPS, and that's including yesterday's game with the two hits, including a homer. Over the last 2 years, over 1,000 plate appearances, he has a 741 OPS. So my crazy prediction is that for the rest of the season, Nimmo will have a 900 OPS. So tell me, is that crazy?
Yes, it is.
All
You
right.
got me, Brian. Oh my god.
Each week, Ryan, I come up with these things, and it's tough. You're trying to thread the needle, come up with something that on the surface is preposterous, but has at least a 5% chance of happening. And week after week, the guest goes, "No, that's not crazy. No, that's not crazy." So it warmed my heart. It warmed my heart that you didn't miss a beat. Boom, crazy. I dig it. All right, so tell me yours. Give me yours.
Well, I also had the same dilemma as you, as what is something that Brian might think is actually crazy that could actually happen. So I racked my brain, and you know what? Pete Alonso said yesterday in his post-game interview that he wants to play until he's 40 years old. So my crazy prediction is that Pete will be a Met for another 10 years. Is that crazy?
Yes.
Ah,
Hopefully I was as quick as you were on that. And I did hear Alonso mention that, and I think it's a very noble thing, but I don't know if the history of slugging first basemen playing until their age 40 is a lengthy one. And I'm sure if you spent 10 minutes looking it up, you could probably come up with five names. But in that same, 10 minutes, I could probably come up with 500 of those who were very good in their late 20s, early 30s, and then were out of the game by the time they were 36 or 37. So I congratulate Pete first on the record, and then on being a team player, and then for his desire to keep playing because he loves the game. Those are all wonderful things. I'd be very surprised if he was still playing at age 40.
we were both successful in giving a
I
crazy
love it.
prediction.
I love it. That's the way it's supposed to be. All right, well, let's get back into the realm of reality right now. And we talked about this earlier. David Peterson is the only one who's giving the team length from the starting pitching, and you can say to a certain extent that the pitchers not going six or more innings has been negated somewhat by the strong bullpen. But that aside, who do you think will be the next Mets pitcher to complete 6 innings?
I think through the process of elimination, you can rule out Clay Holmes. I half expect him to get moved to the bullpen in favor of Sproat coming in the coming weeks. And maybe we'll say goodbye to the likes of Stanek. So Sproat, McLean, I don't think they're going to have a long enough leash to go through six. I think Senga has a short leash and he's a candidate to get to six, but he needs to be efficient in order to get through six. So my prediction would be that Mania would be the next to actually do it. I think he's been strong through multiple innings in some of his outings, and then he tends to get blown up in an inning, and that ultimately leads to him getting yanked. So if he can find the consistency, he's likely to go deeper into games. So my prediction would be Mania. Although if the question is who's going to be the next Mets pitcher, Peterson pitching tonight, he'll pitch through six. If it's what other pitcher could possibly get through six other than Peterson, I think it's Mania.
It's so frustrating with Senga, who was so good before he got injured on that throw covering first base. And then he just hasn't been able to find it ever since. And it's just like, man, if only that injury didn't happen. And then you look at Mania, who was so great last year, and then this year he had the injury at the start, and he hasn't been able to put it together. And it's just it's frustrating. I don't know any other way to phrase it other than that. These are guys who should be out there giving the length that Peterson is, and they're simply not doing it. Are they not capable? Are they still compensating for their injuries in one way or another? I don't think we've heard anybody throw that out as a possibility. But what else is there? Why is it that Senga was able to give innings earlier and now he can't? And why is it that Mania was able to do it last year and now he can't? So, I mean, at least with Holmes, you can say, well, the guy's never or was barely a starting pitcher in the majors, and that was 7 years ago. And we just don't have those excuses with Mania and Senga.
You wrote the other day that superstitions maybe will help the Mets break out of this funk that they're in. And Peterson, you mentioned Peterson's mustache, which I sported a mustache myself for the last 6 months. I think Peterson's mustache looks great. And maybe it has been the secret sauce
Yeah.
that has led him to the longevity and the length that he's been able to offer in games. So maybe the superstition should actually be that all the starting pitchers should
Have you
grow very
seen
cool mustaches.
have you seen Mania's mustache?
I have.
I think I grew a better one when I was 12.
Yeah.
That's pretty ugly. If nothing else, he should get a magic marker and fill it in a little bit. I mean, it's kind of remarkable that a guy in his early 30s doesn't have a better mustache than that.
Mania strikes me as the kind of guy who would be willing to put a little magic marker on the upper lip just for the team.
So you're talking about Peterson, and I think I called it the Paul Blart Mall Cop mustache.
That was right. Yeah.
It's definitely thick. It's not the wispy Mania thing, but at least with Peterson last year, he had the overall 10-day growth thing going on, where he had the beard and the mustache from not shaving, not necessarily growing out a mustache like he is this year. So maybe he's grandfathered in for his attempts last year at the facial hair, but I don't know. But maybe 13 run performance and what was it, 5 1/3 from the bullpen. Maybe the time for superstition is gone.
I really hope you're right about that, but recent history would suggest maybe not.
All right. So earlier we talked about the four guys who typically bat at the top of the order, potentially taking a day off, and it's almost a mixed bag because why don't you want your best players out there versus well, these guys are all struggling. Maybe they could deal with a blow. So do you think that there's merit to giving guys days off? I mean, we see all the time these people who've been Iron Men, um, all of a sudden coming down with injuries, and the last thing we want is for any of those four guys to get injured. So, what's your take on the days off situation?
I think it's a mixed bag because I think, like you mentioned about injury last year, Francisco Lindor went down with a back injury towards the end of the season. Cunha got called up, had a hot streak. But by the time Lindor came back, that's when all the heroics happened. Game 161 against the Braves, the grand slam against the Phillies. Like, he was right when he came back. So I think that side of the argument could easily be made for why give some of these star players a day off. But I've also heard it said that guys don't rest their way out of slumps. And if yesterday was any indication of that, maybe that's true. So I also think that there's a mental component to being given a day off. Sometimes it can be a shot to your ego that I'm not performing and my manager thinks that it would be better if I wasn't playing for the team. Again, there's that mental aspect to it that maybe that sets a person off down deeper and they're not actually at the plate working out their slump. So Do I think they should be given a day off? I don't. I think that Mendoza is tinkering with the lineup, trying to figure out ways to get his guys going. And at different points throughout the season, batting Nimmo in leadoff paid off for a little while until it didn't. Marte in leadoff for a little while until it didn't. So I think, Mendoza has been trying to find other ways to get his guys going. And the only move that he's yet to have made is batting Juan Soto leadoff. So fingers crossed that he'll consider that in the upcoming weeks.
So in the 2006 to 2008 period, the Mets really rode their core players hard, and that was Beltran and Delgado and Reyes and Wright, and those guys were very healthy. And then 2009 came, and all of those guys ended up being injured, and Delgado was essentially career-ending injury. So, I guess that's always somewhat in the back of my mind. It's like, well, we've seen this movie before, and I don't like the way that it ends. So I'm in favor of giving those guys rest. All right. Well, we are out of time here. So any last thoughts?
I really hope that the beatdown of the Braves yesterday is the catalyst that we needed. Pete Alonso breaking the home run record. The news that Nolan McLean's on his way. I'm hoping that all of this news and this change in pace really gets the guys going because it was a tough watch for the last couple of weeks. So my last thought is let's go Mets. Let's turn this season around. Let's make sure that we end the season on a strong note.
All right. Well, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to give you a second crazy prediction. This was one that I considered before going with the Nimmo one, and that's the Mets lost their first 5 games against the Braves this season, and my crazy prediction is they're going to win the rest of them. So they've already won 3, so that's what 5 more to go. So would that have been crazy?
With the record that the Braves have against the Mets, I mean, I think it would have been crazy just because they have our number and it is hard to win 5 games against one team. So, yeah, I think that also would have qualified as a crazy one.
All right. Well, we can't end on a better note than 2 or 3 crazy predictions in all. I want to thank Ryan for joining me today. We're recording this 1 o'clock or so, and hopefully Ryan and anyone who's listening will be able to join us in the game chatters. All right. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.